The chains and the guns need not be discussed here. But we did have an invitation. And what we did change the structure of the United States.
Perhaps because of that strange invitation, Africans past and present have lived their lives in the so-called New World as strangers unwillingly brought to a strange land. To accurately look at the African diasporic community, you should divide its arrival here into two phases. As we discussed in part 6 of this series, the first leg of the African diasporic journey was voluntary and took place centuries ago. Dr. Ivan van Sertima says wars between Asians and Africans during the age of Egyptian pharaohs forced an African army equipped with bronze weapons to maneuver away from traditional waterways because they were controlled by Asian armies bearing iron weapons.
Africans, Phoenicians, and other people had to make use of the Mediterranean west of the Mediterranean. That's why you have a lot of movement of navies, military and commercial, west of the Mediterranean. That's how they got in the North Atlantic. Nobody intended to come to America. I don't believe that. Okay, Columbus never intended to come here. He intended to come to India. This place was actually called India. It wasn't called America because he thought he'd actually got there. You have a later period when it was intentional, like the Mandingo. That's a later period. That's around the 14th century, where they intentionally set out because they had news that there were lands west of the Ocean Sea. Okay? Columbus didn't set out because he thought there was an America, a new continent. He set out because he thought he could go to the west and end up in the east. Okay? Which is theoretically true, but you'd need an airplane to do it. Okay, the thing is that in the Olmec case, you have fleets that were probably in the North Atlantic, both military and commercial fleets in the North Atlantic. And you have perhaps an accident that brought these people in that direction. They then were incorporated into the Olmec thing. They couldn't be all male, okay? Because we found pure African females as well. They were largely male, but they couldn't be all male. One of the things that people do not understand is that people did not travel in fleets like if they were sailors. Sailors don't man big boats. Boats have doctors, they have carpenters, they have women, they have nurses, they have everything. A boat is a moving world.
In part 6 of this series, we also explained how Africans use these miniature spaceships or moving worlds to travel this entire planet. Again, it's important to remember Africans voluntarily completed this part of their diaspora with their own maritime technology developed and used before the Europeans invaded their continent. We can sum up what's usually taught about the African movement around the world in one word: slavery. Most Eurocentric scholars would have you believe that slavery became the most significant event in the history of all African peoples. The fact that this series doesn't even explain the subject until the 8th part of a 10-segment presentation alerts you to the fact that there are vast amounts of African history often ignored, though scholastically known and documented for years.
The dispersion of black people from sub-Saharan Africa has an extensive history. Their presence is attested in ancient Greece and Rome, and later throughout the Islamic world. The mode of dispersion was by the caravan routes of the Sahara Desert and from the east coast of Africa over the Pacific and its subbodies such as the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. The trans-Saharans were well attested in southern Europe, Italy, Iberia, and Byzantium in the centuries preceding the Maritime Age. But these dispersed peoples never formed diasporic communities. Chiefly functioning as domestic slaves, they interacted and interbred with bonded and other low-status people, both native and alien, in the lands they inhabited, and thus disappeared in a literal melting pot.
Post-Civil War violence in the United States stopped this type of melting pot activity for African Americans. But before the war came slavery. It makes up the second part of the African diaspora, as well as depositing a legacy of lies and shame into the diasporic community. Atlanta cardiologist and diasporic historian Dr. Arthur Lee sees the forced movement of African people to the New World as something biological and not necessarily negative.
So the diaspora is called an evil thing by some. Some associate it with a certain amount of meanness and violence of the Middle Passage, bringing Africans who were captured in warfare, sold as slaves, and brought in less than first-class accommodations in slave ships, died by millions. Well, I could say that's the evil part, but maybe there's a good part to it. You could say, well, there's a Darwinian process of natural selection. Maybe one of the things that slavery does is to accelerate natural selection so that you're continually wiping out weaker and weaker segments of the gene pool, and you're left with a super resistant, a super strong portion of the gene pool. And the way that the European colonists used the African slaves, say in the Low Country in South Carolina, the resistance to malaria, the ability to work in the heat and the sun, the resistance to ultraviolet radiation, and so forth, has resulted in a, I hate to use the term super race, but a race that is so strong that you'd have to invent a social system to keep them from overwhelming you biologically. Hence, we have the American tradition of racism.
Anytime one group of people tries to show its superiority by destroying another group, the opposite effect usually takes place. A Holocaust is a disgusting event in the history of any people, but its results are usually a genetic base stronger than what existed before the man-made pruning. Dr. Lee admits the gene pool of Africans in America may have developed some weaknesses during the weeding out period known as slavery. One such negative development comes with an African American's biological ability to conserve salt. That became a necessity for people who worked 10 to 12 hours in the sun without a break. But it's now a possible liability to the descendants of those slaves.
If you eat lots of French fries with your Big Macs, your ability to conserve salt, of course, is not really a useful adaptation to this new environment. And so the hypertension begins to arise as something that doesn't suit you well for survival.
Another persistent myth about the African diaspora concerns the kinds of knowledge African slaves brought with them and what American slave traders or buyers knew of African history and skills.
Many people think that Africans came here as naked, blank slates, and they were just imported because of their color. But what isn't in the popular literature is the fact that planters who were importing Africans knew a little bit about where they came from, even though it may have only gone to the port of debarkation. They knew who was coming and where they were coming from, and many were imported specifically for characteristics and skills that they had. I was doing research last year, and I found that in South Carolina, the rice planters of Charleston imported or requested slaves from Senegambia specifically, and some from Angola, because there's a rice growing tradition in these areas that goes back 1,000 years before Christ. Now, the rice that was used was a Madagascar strain, but the techniques that were used to grow these rice were brought over by the Africans that were imported, because the English people did not know how to grow rice, because you don't grow rice in England. It doesn't grow in that climate. Now, the organizational structure of the farm was set up by the English in line with their own ideas of farm organization. But the techniques, the technology was brought over by the Africans that they imported specifically for that purpose.
It's true. When the first Africans got on board ships and came to the Americas, they didn't think of themselves as slaves. They left their homelands as kings, queens, statesmen, and mathematicians. But when they got off those ships, their soon-to-be masters had to change their minds to make them into the chattel slaves that were necessary to build the economic welfare of our country.
Now, they often talk about our illiterate stage and say we were not illiterate. We were unliterate. Some of us spoke 3 and 4 languages. But we were introduced to a new language. We couldn't speak this new language. So here again, we reached into